And I know you're as anxious as I am to get into close action. But we must bring him right up beside us before we spring this trap. That will test our nerve. And discipline will count just as much as courage.
The Age of Fighting Sail. Part 6. The Battle of the Saints. In all his life, John Clerk never went to sea. He was 10 years old before he even saw his first ship in the harbor at Leith, the seaport for Edinburgh. But he had read the shipwreck saga Robinson Crusoe and had become fascinated by a ship model owned by some of his schoolmates. He soon thought of joining the Navy, but was forbidden to do so by his family. Young John Clerk had to be satisfied with sailing small boats in Leith Harbor, and with hours spent on the pier studying the way sailing ships employed the wind. He returned home to build ship models, sail them on his father's pond, and experiment with rudders and rigging. As he grew older, naval tactics became his hobby and obsession. He covered his family's tables with charts and drawings of tactics. He carved dozens of wooden ship models small enough to carry 2 fleets about in his pockets, so he could work out his formations whenever he found himself with a few spare moments at a table nearby. He became an Edinburgh merchant, but he doodled endlessly with his battle diagrams, worked out innumerable combinations of ship-of-the-line formations with his ship models, and analyzed and reanalyzed the naval canon, fighting instructions. With his fresh eye, John Clerk detected the most serious weakness in the line-ahead formation. It depended for success on the enemy's cooperation. He had to form a line of battle as well. For the most part, the enemy fleets had done so up to now, but with the French Navy adopting its new tactics of hit and run, unless the French had a numerical superiority, Clerk concluded that the time-honored line-ahead formation was usually worthless. And when he read about the wildly publicized court-martial of Keppel and Palliser after the Battle of Usan, he was even more convinced. The issue at court was whether Keppel had formed a proper line-ahead, while to Clerk it seemed clear that the French had escaped because Keppel had insisted on a line-ahead and had waited too long to form it in any case. This was too much for Clerk. He started to write a book decrying the old tactics and offering some novel ideas of his own. Entitled An Essay on Naval Tactics, John Clerk's study was intended as a textbook for naval officers. It was packed with diagrams and charts, and its major proposition was concentration of fire, directing the greater part of the force of the fleet against a few ships, either in the van or the rear. It was stunningly simple. Clerk advocated that instead of always parading properly and fighting one-on-one in gentlemanly fashion, the Navy concentrate on just one part of the opposing fleet, employing all of its ships against a few of the enemy's. The principle depended on a fundamental fact of fighting sail. A vessel's maneuverability was determined by the velocity and direction of the wind. Thus, for example, one could attack the rear section of a line of ships and devastate it before the leading ships could double back to the rescue. A ship of the line might take as long as half an hour or more to simply come about. In the past, the ships in numerous sea battles had split into separate groups of combatants, but most of these situations had occurred by accident and not by design. John Clerk became a zealot. He traveled to London, and through friends of friends, tried to peddle his ideas to the Admiralty, and to any captain or admiral to whom he was introduced. Naval warfare was a popular subject in England in those days, and any Royal Navy successes brought cheering crowds into the streets, and a loss stimulated editorials, letters, petitions, and similar outcries across all the country. Clerk began to attract attention, at least among civilians. Enough friends, acquaintances, and Navy buffs were interested in his book to permit a limited printing. But the Navy was something else entirely. Copies were sent to the Admiralty and to many admirals, only to be greeted with serious disinterest. Many of the recipients, when asked, said they had not bothered to read the book. Others denied that they had even seen it. One admiral, who publicly acknowledged the work and actually went so far as to praise it, did so with the patronizing comment, "And when I reflect that its ingenious author is only a military seaman in theory, I cannot sufficiently express my approbation of it." But a number of admirals and captains were quietly reading Clerk's book in the privacy of their cabins and studies. One of them was a man who would soon make naval history. George Bridges Rodney was autocratic, profane, and brilliant. He had been naval commander-in-chief in the West Indies before the War of Independence. He had also served as governor of Greenwich Hospital for old and infirm sailors. By 1774, Rodney's gambling debts had grown so huge that in order to escape his creditors, he had fled to Paris during a rare period of peace between England and France. When more creditors in Paris threatened to close in on him, he was rescued by a friend in a grand gesture of chivalry. The wealthy Louis-Antoine de Gontant, Duc de Biron, proffered Rodney a loan that permitted him to return to London, where in 1779 he was reassigned to the West Indies. It was an even more important post than before. Not only was much of the naval warfare of the American Revolution being fought in the West Indies, but the area also served as the British base of naval operations for the North American coast. Rodney was therefore the recipient of much well-wishing and a great deal of well-meaning advice. According to John Clerk, it was through a mutual friend that Rodney was given a manuscript copy of Clerk's An Essay on Naval Tactics. Admiral Rodney was a member of the conservative school of tactics and a supporter of the line-ahead battle formation. Yet he was also a man with an open mind. He did not comment directly to Clerk, but an acquaintance recalled an evening before Rodney's departure when the Admiral sat at dinner table demonstrating with cherry pits among the port glasses how he planned to break the French line. And when another friend asked Rodney what he thought of John Clerk's theories, the Admiral simply responded, "Ha! You shall see what I think of it the first time I meet the French fleet." In fact, he did not employ Clerk's cut-the-line tactics the first time he met the French fleet, though he did depart somewhat from the orthodoxies of the day. En route to the West Indies, with 22 sail of the line, he encountered an enemy squadron off the Portuguese coast, just below Cape St. Vincent. It was the Spanish contingent of a force blockading Britain's base at Gibraltar. In the so-called Moonlight Battle on January 16, 1780, in wintry gale winds, Rodney did not wait for the Spaniards to form a line or to form one himself. Plagued with gout, an aged man at 61, he gave his commands from his berth. He did not cut the enemy's line, because there was no line to cut. But he routed the Spanish fleet, capturing or destroying 7 of the 11 ships. The blockade of Gibraltar was lifted. Rodney became a national hero and was knighted. He continued on to the West Indies, where he fought 2 inconclusive battles with the French. In neither of them did he have the opportunity to go for the enemy's line. He remained there for a year, during which he amassed a fortune in prize money from privateers, and from a looting expedition against the rich Dutch island of St. Eustatius. Then, in the summer of 1781, in great discomfort from the gout and chronic prostate trouble, he returned to England to take advantage of the healing waters of Bath. By December 1781, as all England was agonizing over the Navy's sorry performance at Chesapeake Bay, and the subsequent surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown, Rodney prepared to return to the West Indies and went aboard the Formidable, a 90-gun ship of the line. But westerly gales delayed his journey, and he went ashore to wait out the storm at Cawsan Bay. The son of a port commissioner, Paul Ory, later remembered when the admiral and the commissioner propped their gouty feet before a fire, and he overheard Rodney declare that if he ever neared the rascal de Grasse, he would break his line. In February of 1782, Rodney was back in the West Indies. His second-in-command was Sir Samuel Hood, who had helped to lose the Battle of Chesapeake Bay. The winner of that battle, Comte de Grasse, had also returned to the West Indies. Rodney and de Grasse finally met in April of 1782 off the island of Dominica. De Grasse had 33 ships of the line to Rodney's 36, but the French Navy's orders were to avoid pitched battles whenever possible, and under these circumstances de Grasse was convoying an assault force to attack England's most important West Indies possession, Jamaica. Rodney had guessed de Grasse's target, and when he had been warned that he should keep a protective squadron near Barbados, St. Lucia, and Antigua, he answered that there was no need, that Jamaica was 10 times more consequence than all of them put together. De Grasse turned north, Rodney followed. For 4 days he chased his quarry along the westward shores of Martinique and Dominica. At this point, de Grasse became the victim of bad fortune. It first took the form of a series of misadventures by the hard-luck French 74-gunner Zélé. On the night of April 10th, after 2 days of chase, the Zélé collided with the 64-gunner Jason. Both were too damaged to keep up with the rest of the French fleet. The Jason was sent off to port for repairs, while the Zélé's crew tried to make their repairs at sea. The next morning, Rodney spotted the crippled Zélé and sent a few ships to take her. De Grasse countered by coming back to cover her. On the night of the 11th, the Zélé collided with another French ship, the Ville de Paris, and put herself entirely out of action. De Grasse was forced to abandon her. He now had 31 ships, and Rodney, with his 36, was almost upon him. Moreover, de Grasse found himself in a trap. His northward progress was blocked by a group of islets known as the Saints, between Dominica and Guadeloupe. He considered ducking through the passage between the two islands, but the wind was blowing through the channel from the east. His only open route lay to the south. He would have to double back on his pursuers. But at least, as at Ushant, it would be a passing engagement with the fleets on opposite tacks. They would sail past each other at a combined speed of 4 to 5 knots, even in the dying breezes. The British gunners would be unable to concentrate on the French hulls, while the French could still cut up the British rigging. It took much pounding to damage stout oaken hulls, but one good broadside of flying chain and bar could slice through the great areas of shrouds and braces. De Grasse turned south, and Rodney turned to meet him as he came past. At first, it looked like every other Royal Navy battle for the past century. In an unswerving line ahead, Rodney's fleet moved alongside the French fleet as it filed past. His gunners aimed at the French hulls as de Grasse's gunners sent chain and bar shots slashing through the British rigging. The topmasts of nearly every ship cracked and twisted as the flying shot cut them away. But now de Grasse became the victim of foul luck from which there was no escape. The wind shifted. It hauled from east to southeast and hit de Grasse's line at the center. The French ships at the center and rear, already close hauled, had to fall off slightly to keep their wind. Others were taken aback and stalled. Gaping holes appeared in the French line. Had John Clerk been aboard Rodney's flagship, he would have cheered. Here was the perfect example he had hypothesized in so many diagrams and in so many tabletop maneuvers with his pocket models. The enemy line was open and waiting to be cut. At this point, Rodney may or may not have suffered an attack of indecision. Only one record survives to tell what transpired on the Formidable's quarterdeck during the next few minutes. Many years later, Sir Charles Dashwood, who had been a midshipman aboard Rodney's flagship, recounted a vivid scene. As he related it, Fleet Captain Sir Charles Douglas had climbed onto the hammock nettings at the forward rail of the quarterdeck to study the ships ahead and saw the gaps in the French line. One gap was directly ahead. Climbing down, he asked Midshipman Dashwood, "Dash, where's Sir George?" Dashwood had just replied that the Admiral was in his cabin when Rodney came back. Doffing his hat, Douglas approached Rodney and urged, "Break the line, Sir George. The day is our own, and it will ensure your victory." "No," said Rodney, "I will not break my line." The two men paced the quarterdeck in opposite directions, turning and coming back towards each other. Douglas tried once more. "Only break the line, Sir George, and the day is your own." This time Rodney replied, "With grudging permission." Douglas immediately ordered the helm to port. The Formidable swung across the line of battle and moved through the French line, all guns firing as she went. In the hail of cannonballs from the British flagship, the French warship Glorieux lost all her masts at once. The Formidable flew no signal for breaking the enemy's line because there was none in her flag locker, and Rodney must have watched anxiously at his stern windows. Whether or not he had been talked into it, he had made a radical decision. The question was whether his fleet still under line ahead would break precedent and follow his lead. Within minutes, Commodore Edmund Affleck in the 74-gun Bedford went through another opening, splitting it so that the entire British rear could follow the Bedford through. Captain Alan Gardner of the Duke had in fact preceded Rodney through the line by accident. The wind shift had pushed the French ship opposite him across the Duke's bow. In horror at the thought of being cut off, Gardner looked to the flagship, which was next astern to him, and with vast relief watched as the Formidable turned through the line. The Duke swung over and followed her. Unlike his compatriot in the Battle of Chesapeake Bay, Rodney immediately hauled down his line-ahead signal, keeping aloft the ones for close action. Rounding up the unprepared Frenchmen on the other side, the British ships isolated and surrounded small contingents of the disordered French line, concentrating 4 ships against 3, and in some cases 3 against 1. The French ship Ardent, carrying most of the siege artillery for the attack on Jamaica, struck her colors after a few exchanges of fire. Most of the French decks were crowded with soldiers for the Jamaica assault, and they were mowed down by British shot. So many bodies were dumped over the French sides that the sea quickly became tinged with red, and schools of sharks moved in among the ships. The dismasted Glorieux was taken in tow by a French frigate. British men of war moved in on them. The Formidable had gone through the French line at about 9 a.m. The swirling battle went on, with a pause during the flat midday calm. into the late afternoon. By then, 5 of the French ships had struck their colors. The Glorieux was cut away from her tow by the British pursuers. The prize of the battle was the 104-gun French flagship, the Ville de Paris, on which half a dozen British ships concentrated their fire. As her hull splintered and her rigging disintegrated under the storm of shot, the French flagship's gun crews fought back until all their cartridges were gone, and they had to ladle the powder into the gun barrels. By late afternoon, her rudder knocked out and her cannonballs used up, the Ville de Paris rolled helplessly in the sea as Hood's Barfleur came down and sent a last flaming broadside into her. On the Ville de Paris' quarterdeck, a tall figure stood by himself. Admiral de Grasse finally hauled down his flagship's colors. As he did, Rodney brought the Formidable alongside the Barfleur, and the officers from both ships were rowed to the French flagship to climb her side and accept de Grasse's surrender.